Therefore, the costs might be nearly the same, but the timing would be different of things. Tough decisions that have to be made.
Moving on to assessments?
Yeah, let's, and hopefully this will answer some more questions, but we'll probably leave all of the room with some questions when I finish this that will hopefully be answered in the coming months. So the first piece is once we adopted the new standards, you typically don't want to test to the new standards as soon as you adopted them. You want to actually provide time for implementation. So we knew that as soon as we adopted those standards in June of 2012, there ought to be a period of time before you begin assessing those new standards. The truth is you need to leave time so people just become aware of what action took place. So last year we actually did a lot of work around awareness of the new standards and started getting into transitioning from the prior standards to the new standards. Right now we're working with many districts on that transition and moving into the implementation, actually implementing those new standards so that they begin that process by 2015, but actually the real important year will be the year after when you have the second assessment. You begin to look at how much did kids grow from the first time they took that assessment to the second time they took that assessment. So we wanted to have an implementation lag in terms of the assessment. The second thing that I want to bring up is that there will be necessary regulatory changes, but there won't be any new regulations necessary. So let me explain what I mean by that. We currently have a document that we have to adopt in regulation called the Participation Guidelines. It indicates how do special education students get to take this assessment without invalidating the assessment. That's the accommodations guideline. Well, as we look at any new assessment, you might have to change the accommodations guidelines because you look at each assessment, determine what accommodations you can give that don't invalidate the assessment. So we'll have to probably have a new accommodations guideline. But it won't be a new regulation, it will be an updated regulation. The other types of things that are in regulations is what tests are, what grade levels do we test at? If we chose to test at 11th grade versus 10th grade, we'd have to make a shift there. We also have things like what the security rules are. Well, if we did some testing or all testing online, but maybe even just in some districts did online testing, the security rules might need to change. So again, I want to reiterate, we don't anticipate new regulations, we anticipate updating regulations. One of the questions that I've been asked that I hope add a lot of clarity around is, so what tests will be traded out as a result of this? And what tests will we still have to give, and who requires those tests? I hope this chart that I have up now.
And what happens if we don't?
And what happens if
always have that choice of not to.
Exactly. And then we'll go over the funding implications of don't at the end. But that's a little, well, we'll get to that part at the end in terms of the funding. So first, let me just describe the orientation of this chart. Let me start with saying the assessments that will be traded out because of these standards are the standards-based assessments, often referred to as SBAs, in reading, writing, and mathematics. Not science, because we didn't change the science standards. Also,
so on the science test, because this consortiums we're talking about just reading and math, what will you use for science? Do you still use the same SBAs you use now?
Representative Wilson, that's correct. We've continued doing our current assessment, which is, it's currently a standalone booklet given to 3 grade levels, 4, 8, and 10, I think. I'm not sure about 4, actually. I think it might be 5. We made it, I think NAEP is given in 4th grade, so we chose to not give it in a grade NAEP was given. So I believe it's in 5 and 8. So that will continue to be given. So I put in red, if you have this in color, the things that would change, and it's the top 2 assessments. In addition to the standards-based assessment, the alternate would have to change, because the alternate is an assessment for students with significant cognitive disabilities who are unable to take the standards-based assessment. It's a very small group of students, about 600 or 700, I would guess. I'm guessing that number. And it's designed, everyone takes a standards-based assessment unless you can't. So students who are usually severely cognitively disabled. So those are the two assessments that would change out. So the way I've laid this table out is what the assessment's called, who takes the assessment is the middle column, and who requires that. And I basically abbreviated those requirements with just the overall law. So in that final column, you'll see it's either required by the Elementary Secondary Education Act, or you'll see it's required, or and maybe, in the first case it's or and, Alaska statute, and in one case, Alaska Administrative Code, which means that it's state regulation adopted by the state board. So those first two assessments are our accountability assessments used to drive the accountability system. Those two would change out. We have to change them if we want to test our new standards. So if we chose not to change them and stay with those, we actually would be testing standards that no longer are required to be taught. We'd have new standards of which we wouldn't have a test for. That would be one implication, so if people actually move and begin teaching the new standards, but in 2015 we still test using the old assessment, we actually will have a mismatch between what's taught and what's being assessed. The other piece that would be a requirement is we would lose the waiver, because the waiver was contingent on adopting college and career-ready standards and then putting an assessment in place that assesses that. And we'll get into more clarity around the waiver, but in many ways what it does is the waiver did allow us to drive forward something Alaska preferred and got out of some federal oversight in terms of a system that we had no voice in, and we would have to go back to all the No Child Left Behind rules that previously existed. The other assessments listed on here are ones that, actually you saw a more detailed table, and I know you see a lot of things during session, but one of the things I presented at subcommittee at one time was a more detailed table like this, and it goes over all of the assessments and who requires them. So I'm not going to go into those unless at the end of the assessment section there are specific questions around those.
President Reinbold, I know I broke my rules too, so go ahead. Okay, I just want to know, teachers are constantly complaining they have too many days testing. I mean, this doesn't look like much less testing to me. So I'm just wondering, is there any possibility of limiting some of these other tests that they're complaining about?
To the chair, Representative Reinbold, well, the Elementary Secondary Education Act requires those top four.
Mm-hmm.
So if we continue to participate in the Elementary Secondary Education Act, you need to do those top four. And the very first one is in Alaska statute also. So at the end of the presentation, we'll talk about the dollars connected to this and the implications of dollars of not participating. Clearly, we can't choose not to participate in those. The developmental profile is actually less of an assessment in terms of sit down and give kids a test. It's actually something teachers generally give as the students are new to them. So it's given to kindergarten students and new first grade students. And often they structure it in such a way that teachers actually really appreciate this. It helps them get to know their learner as they're coming in. So that one, well, I don't see that one as burdensome and duplicative of any grades. The high school graduation qualifying exam is a test completely under state statute. It's required by state statute, not by federal statute. We talked about it a little bit earlier. Is it the time to have that discussion? And it may be. And then work keys is an assessment given because the state board put that requirement forward, but in part because it qualifies students for the career portion of the Alaska Performance Scholarship. So that's what drives them. I am not on any of the policy boards or in the legislature where you make the decisions as to what should go forward. The one I do think is probably timely to discuss is the qualifying exam, but that's probably a greater discussion both at the administrative level as well as during the legislative session.
But the standards-based assessment, we're not required to do that every year. We choose to do that every year. Is that not correct?
You're required to do that under ESEA.
Every year?
Every year, yes.
And so is the English language proficiency, is that every year 3 through 10 as well?
You're correct. That's actually K-12, and it's only students who are limited English proficient. So it's the last time I worked in the assessment world was about 5 years ago, but we were testing around 17,000 students of our 130,000 students on that assessment. So it's only limited English proficient students take that particular assessment.
And do those same 17,000, that just seems like an awful lot, also take the whatever testing that we choose for the standards-based assessment, or do they only take the English language proficiency?
They take both assessments because there are two different purposes behind them. The one is to determine whether they have made progress in terms of learning the English language. The other one is to test their content knowledge. So the English language proficiency assessment assesses language proficiency. Are you able to speak, write, read, and comprehend English better? It doesn't test the content knowledge.
No, I understand that, but if I can't speak or understand English very well, so I'm taking the English language proficiency, odds are that I'm not going to do very good, well, yeah, I'm trying to watch my own English, very well on the standards-based assessment because the other one already proved that I don't have what I need to get up to the next one.
Representative Wilson, I don't disagree with you a bit, and actually I'll give you a little more history behind this. So first off, the requirement they take that other assessment, it's required, but if they are not proficient in the English language, they get accommodations just as a student who is in special education gets accommodations. So they do get an accommodated test. The second piece is we don't completely disagree with you. We actually went to the U.S. Department of Education and requested a waiver from those kids having to take the test at least until their 3 years of instruction in the English language. That was denied. What we do have is students who take the standards-based assessment who are limited English proficient, who are new immigrants to the country for a particular number of years. I think it is 2. They must take the assessment, but we don't have to account those results in the accountability system. So it's a federal requirement to receive the federal funding under ESEA, and that's where.
And how many days is that testing?
Do you remember the English language proficiency link? There are 4 subtests. They're not as long as a standards-based assessment. So I would envision for groups of students, and sometimes you give them to smaller groups, that it occupies part of 4 different days, but it would be a limited part of 4 days, if I'm remembering that one correctly.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Representative Wilson.
Are all of those English language proficiency students, do they all have IEPs?
No, not necessarily. There may be some that would have IEPs because they're also in special education, but what they typically have is a learning plan, and that learning plan outlines the kinds of things that would be accommodations they'd receive on the test, as well as the kind of things that the general education teachers would need to provide in terms of support for that student to be successful on the content within instruction. So technically it's not an IEP that has the contractual types of things with it that are required under the special education law, but there are individual plans for those students.
Do those plans go along when they do the standards-based assessment?
Representative Wilson, yes, they do that. That plan describes what accommodations that limited English proficient student would receive.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Reinbold.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Okay, basically what my question is I've been to an education meeting recently, and I believe they said that there were 17 days of testing throughout the school year from state, federal, district, and things like the Terra Nova. There's just a lot of, and now, of course, this is going to be this new assessment, the PARC or Smarter Balance. So we're just trying to figure out when the teachers, just to maximize their time in the classroom to educate rather than just test all the time. So where does Terra Nova fall into all this? And is there anything as legislators you need us to look into to allow the teachers more freedom to educate rather than just test all the time?
Through the chair, Representative Reinbold, the Terra Nova, which is not on this list, the state board removed that requirement. So that was one that could be removed based on the interpretations from the Attorney General's office. The state board then said, let's remove it, because the governor, as you'll recall, in last year's State of the State said he's asked the state board to look at tests we could get rid of that were outdated. So we've eliminated that one. I don't know that I would say there's 17 days of testing, because if I were an English language proficient, if I were a limited English proficient student.
No, well, wait, let's make you a 4th grader or an 8th grader, so that you're going to count in the NAEP test, because you got caught up it was your lucky day to do the NAEP.
My lucky day.
Yeah, your lucky day. You get every test that comes about. So you get to do the NAEP, the English language proficient, and the standards-based assessment that year.
So I think I may have 9 days of testing then.
And so if we had the Terra Nova before, that may have come, now that we had just, I mean, it's been just like the last year in which that finally went off the books. A couple meetings ago, I believe, actually.
3 days.
Through the right, but if I'm in 4th grade and had to take the NAEP, I wouldn't take the Terra Nova. We clearly made sure that the Terra Nova and the NAEP were not on the same year because of that reason. So I understand. I taught for 11 years. I was a principal for 6. I didn't love testing, but I just don't want to say it's more than it is, and I can't get 17 days. I can get 9. I get 9 days if I'm taking all the tests in the grade. I don't come up with a combination of more than that. But that doesn't make it any better, because in addition to the state required assessments, many districts add some requirements. And so 17 might not be the wrong number when you add other local assessments that get added to that. So I wouldn't want to say that's wrong, because a teacher's going to look at, they don't care who required it. They're going to look at their whole year and how many days they're taking tests. So that might be an accurate number given by some teacher in a district in Alaska.
Thank you. Just through the chair, just one more follow-up question. When did the Terra Nova, was it this year?
Yeah, through the chair, Reinbold, the state, it was still given this year. The state board considered that regulation throughout the winter during legislative session. It was out for public comment, so it was adopted, I think, in April, so that it could take effect by the time the school year begins, and it would not become a requirement in this next school year.
Good. Okay, thank you very much.
Assessment always brings out lots of questions. So let me drive on to the next slide.
We're trying to figure out how to make it less.
Yeah, and I understand that. And actually, I hope that table that we're going to leave, I hope that's helpful, because it shows you where the driver is behind it in terms of the law. So you have a new assessment, you have new standards, you have to have a new assessment. Otherwise, you have a mismatch. So we really viewed there are probably 3 options. And actually, I want to also bring up that we've heard from you that how do our students do compared to the rest of the country? So we're trying to figure out, well, what can we do on an assessment? Doesn't mean there's only one choice to do that, but what choice could we put forward that says, how do our kids compare in terms of being ready in Alaska compared to students in Washington or some other place? So we are in tune to that. And then actually at the last meeting during the legislative session, I had talked about one of these options, which is the Smarter Balance Assessment Consortium, and actually mentioned that we had just received this independent review of our standards that said we could, if we wanted to, participate in that assessment. I also said at that meeting, we haven't said we will, we now just have that option, and we're keeping that option open for a little while longer. So I'm going to go through the 3 options we think that we have. The first one is to join one of two assessment consortiums. I'll talk about those, what they are in just a moment. Or build our own assessment, which is an option, what we have right now. We did a custom-built assessment. And I'll tell you why we got there, by the way. 8 years ago, we used a published product by CTB McGraw-Hill. But the published product was not aligned to our standards, so we had to add to that test. And ultimately, then when we wanted to shift, when we were required to go out to bid, a new company won the contract, but the old company owned the test, and they owned so many questions because it was their published product, we couldn't take them to the new vendor. So we made the decision at that time, the commissioner, 3 or 4 commissioners ago said, we're going to build something and we're going to own it. We're never going to get stuck in this spot again. That's how we ended up there, but today might be different. The economy and those kinds of things may tell us building your own assessment isn't the best option. But that's an option we ought to look at and figure out what it would cost. The third option is really to purchase a published assessment that exists, something that already is out there that is aligned to our standards. So those are the 3 options as we see it. I don't know of any other option. If someone knows one, we can put it in the pool and take a look. But whatever option we choose, if we want to continue to get funding through the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, we must prove that the assessment is aligned with our standards. Otherwise, you forfeit the Elementary Secondary Education Act funding, or you take penalties. That's an absolute requirement.
And what are the penalties?
Well, sometimes what the penalties, typically the first penalty is conditions, and the conditions say you will have an assessment within this many years, and then there's monitoring, and that monitoring usually means some periodic level of monitoring to prove that we're on that path. So they usually start with conditions, and then you prove you're going to get there within a time frame. They also, Nebraska was in this situation, and I believe the threat before Nebraska said, okay, we're tired of fighting with you, is they made the choice to shift, but I believe they were going to withhold, and I'm doing this off of memory, I thought it was 20% of their ESEA funding, and at that point they said, we will move to an assessment. And they had to shift their entire program. Nebraska is the only one that had that level under the prior funding and assessment regime for No Child Left Behind. Then so what we're doing is actually we intend to put out a request for proposals, an RFP, in the very near future. And what we intend to learn from that and actually maybe even lock in a vendor is one of 3 things. First off, if you participate in an assessment consortium, and we are advisory only, not governing, with the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium, there are certain things they provide at a cost, and I'm going to go over the costs in a little more. And then there are certain things you still need to pay for. In other words, you get your items from the consortium. You even get a test from the consortium. But they don't administer the test to your students, and they don't bring the test back and score them, and they don't then produce score reports to go to parents and families. So you have to get a vendor to do that. So there's certain things they provide, certain things you still need a vendor for. We're calling those wraparound services. You wrap it around the services you get from the consortium. So we're going to ask to try to get 3 pieces of information in this one RFP, or go multiple routes to get the information if we have to. We want to find out, so what would those wraparound services cost? That way we know, is this an efficient approach and does it make sense? What does it cost to completely build our own assessment, just like we have now, aligned to our standards? So we can find out. I've guessed, based on history of building our last assessment and inflation proving it, but I don't know that that guess is right. The best way to find out if that's right, put a request for proposals out. And then the third choice is, are there published products that a vendor could say, yes, it's aligned to your standards, and here's how we'll prove it to you, and this is how we can show how your students compare to other students nationally, because that's a question people want to know. So we hope to put the RFP out in probably the 3rd to 4th week in August. This is a big RFP, and many states are actually going out to RFP right now to lock down their vendors for 2015. So we want to have a good response, so we anticipate a 6-week window on that. That way we give time to actually, I'll just tell you the first time we did an RFP in this line when I was at the department, it was 2 very thick binders full of information. It takes a lot of work for a company to put these together, so it will take that long. So I anticipate that going out, though, in the probably around the 3rd week of August. And so when we get that information back and score those, we'll learn about the quality of vendors available and the efficiency or maybe lack thereof of doing any one of those options. Another piece that is important is technology readiness. And so we're actually engaging in a process with our current test vendor who does do online testing in other states, not in ours, to determine if we had to do a test using technology, how ready are we? And right now we're using information from the Work Keys assessment, which is online in many districts, not all but most. We are using information that districts supply through their application for E-rate, which tells us broadband and tells us how many machines they have. We're then going to add to that an actual tool that allows the district to turn on every one of their machines and actually go online to a tool that our vendor has that will check the readiness, whether that machine could run an assessment that we anticipate coming out. And the reason we have to do this is not only are these consortium products online, but commercial products, one tool in particular called Aspire that's being developed by ACT that Alabama has decided that they were going to use, it's an online assessment. So almost any direction you go now, you really need to figure out whether you could do that. If it is online, your price comes down because the paper pencil is very expensive. You have to produce the paper pencil, you have to ship it all over. That adds a lot of cost. We may find that what we're in a situation in Alaska, though, is that we're giving some online, some paper pencil. We're going to just work to see where we're at with that as we move that forward.